Hello, MCU fans! Today's video is going to be a relatively short history of the multiverse. Deadpool and Wolverine will be here before you know it, and so I thought this video would help prepare for the movie's arrival. So I do have a playlist of multiversal videos out there. There's 26 total, stretching all the way back to a year ago. Some of the videos get 2,000 to 3,000 views, some as many as 80,000. So clearly this is a topic of interest to folks. But if you were to watch every video in this playlist, it would take 14 hours. Granted, there's 480,000 views across all the videos, but 14 hours is just too much. So I have tried to condense it down as much as possible for this video to give you the history of the multiverse. Now, to talk about it, I'll be mentioning plot points from the movies and shows, and that means that there may be some mild spoilers, but then everything has been out for a while now, so it shouldn't be an issue. So without further ado, let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget, we have a June contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment. You could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And we have a membership option in case you'd like to help me with my goal of doing this full-time one day. But honestly, no matter how you support the channel, it's all greatly appreciated. Leaving comments, liking videos, and subscribing, those things go a long way too. So thank you so much. So this video will be broken into 12 chapters, and I'm not going to read all these. You can pause if you want to, but I just wanted you to see we're going to start with the beginning of the multiverse and go all the way to present day. So, Chapter 1, the beginning of the multiverse. Now, I love this graphic from the Eternals movie because it gives us a nice, concise history of creation. It says, in the beginning, before the 6 singularities, and that's a key word, and the dawn of creation, came the Celestials. We also learned from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 that the Collector says, before creation itself, there were 6 singularities. There's that word again. And in Thor the Dark World, Odin himself says that there are relics that predate the universe itself. And in this case, he's referring to the ether, which was in its original form a singularity. So what is a singularity? Well, Universe Today tells us a curvature singularity is best exemplified by a black hole. At the center of the black hole, space-time becomes a one-dimensional point which contains a huge mass. As a result, gravity becomes infinite and space-time curves infinitely, and the laws of physics as we know them cease to function. That's so wild. Space.com tells us the universal origin story known as the Big Bang postulates that 13.7 billion years ago, our universe emerged from a singularity, a point of infinite density and gravity, and that before this event, space and time did not exist, which means the Big Bang took place at no place and no time. That is so wild. So I do think that's what we're seeing here in Loki Season 1, Episode 6, where we're seeing 2 black holes, singularities, right, that are the origin point for 2 different universes. So we'll talk a lot more about this throughout the video. All right, back to the Eternals. Arishem, the Prime Celestial, created the first sun and brought light into the universe. And here's Arishem doing his work. Thank you, Arishem. We appreciate it. And then back to Guardians, where the Collector explains, then the universe exploded into existence, and the remnants of these systems, the singularities, were forged into concentrated ingots, infinity stones. And then Wong in Infinity War explains, at the dawn of the universe, there was nothing. Then, boom. The Big Bang sent 6 elemental crystals hurling across the virgin universe. And then back to Eternals to wrap things up. Now life began and thrived, and all was in balance. But this is how we got one universe. How did we get the multiverse? Well, in Far From Home, we know that Mysterio was, full of it. He was lying the whole time. But Peter's reaction to the idea of a multiverse is fascinating. He says, sorry, you're saying there's a multiverse? I thought that was theoretical. That changes how we understand the initial singularity. There's that word again, right? We're talking about an eternal inflation system. So what does he mean there? Well, the model of eternal inflation implies that all macroscopic histories permitted by the laws of physics are repeated an infinite number of times in the infinite multiverse. There you go, right? I mean, I love that Marvel, which is, science fiction, right? It's just fiction, but it uses science theory. That's very, very cool. But the question is, how did we get some of these crazier universes, right? In Multiverse of Madness, we see an animated universe. Of course, Moon Girl's animated. Spider-Verse is animated. We also saw a cube universe, and maybe that's how Thanos was able to turn, Drax into cubes by tapping into that reality. Then we have a noir universe, black and white universe, and then the paint universe, right? I love the paint universe, my favorite universe. Let me live one day in the paint universe, please. That would be so much fun. So how did we get these? Well, Wong explains it. These Infinity Stones each control an essential aspect of existence. So the reality stone controls reality, and thus different reality stones could give us different realities. Different time stones could give us different flows of time. In fact, that likely explains why in 838 in Multiverse of Madness has its present day set in 2021. If you look on the left, where they're sampling Stephen Strange from 616, if we zoom in on that date, and I know it's blurry, but you can clearly see it's 2/12/2021. What on earth? Because, of course, in the MCU at this point, it was 2024. So how did we go back 3 years? Well, keep in mind, Miguel in the Spider-Verse, he's from 2099. Noir is from 1933, and I'm pretty sure it's permanently stuck in 1933. And Penny's from 3145. In fact, if you look at all the different Spider-Man universes, and I did a long timeline video on this, you can check that out if you're interested, but everybody has a different present day. How does that happen? Well, the Ancient One gives us the answer. The Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time. So not even just the time stone, the Infinity Stones themselves, all of them, create the flow of time. So therefore, you could have time that goes slower, faster, maybe even is frozen in 1933. So love it. The Infinity Stones are so key to understanding the way the universe is set up. But is it an issue in Endgame that the Infinity Stones were destroyed? Because the Black Widow says, where are the stones? And Thanos says, I used the stones to destroy the stones. But he might be overspeaking there a little bit, because then he says, gone, reduced to atoms. So see, they're not actually destroyed. They're actually broken down to their atomic form, but they do still exist, which shows how powerful the Infinity Stones are, that they can still function, even driven down to atoms. Crazy. All right, so I kind of like this working model of the multiverse, and we're going to come back to it throughout the video to make sure it really works with everything we learn about the MCU. But just with what we know already, you have multiple Big Bangs, right? The eternal inflation system Peter described. Each creates its own set of Infinity Stones, which then determine reality, like paint, cartoon 838, 616, and thus a universe. And then off that universe, we have branches. Now, in Loki, we're going to see they're called branched timelines. And in What If, they're called branched universes. And we're going to talk about why there's different terminology there. But the bottom line is a universe then has branches. So the question is, what do we call this? If the 616 universe has actual branched universes, does that mean this is a multiverse? And if this is a multiverse, what do we call multiple multiverses? You see why this terminology can get kind of tricky, and we'll talk more again about why I think Marvel has maybe made it harder than it needs to, but also has the answer for us. All right, another thing that people bring up is, do we have one origin point or multiple origin points? In a way, I don't know that it matters that much, because the end result is the same. You still get multiple universes. So if you're someone that feels one, origin point that then branches off into many is the way to go, that's fine. I'm going to keep this image because I think it just shows this overall picture really well, but I'm not against one origin point for the entire multiverse. Okay, so let's look at some standard multiversal definitions, and again, we'll see if these apply as we go through the video. So a timeline, that's a chronological arrangement of events in the order of their occurrence. A universe is a four-dimensional space consisting of 3 dimensions of space, length, width, height, and then 1 dimension of time. So really a timeline is an integral part of a universe. It's one of the 4 dimensions. Then there is a base or alternate universe. That's a universe that has its own origin point, its own Big Bang. Versus a branched universe or branched timeline, because we'll see both terms used, is a universe that is anchored to another universe at the point of divergence. That's a nexus point, and we'll learn about that. And then a multiverse is a base universe and its branched universes. Then the question is, what do we call multiple multiverses? Well, at least in the comics, they refer to it as a megaverse. Now, that has never been used in the MCU. I'll be interested to see if they do, but often the MCU trails the comics a bit, and this term was introduced in the comics not too long ago, so we'll see whether Marvel ultimately goes with this or not. But so these are just some helpful terms. At the end of the day, we really need to figure out, what do we call this? So let's take a look over at the Spider-Verse for a minute, because I find this fascinating. Miguel in the Spider-Verse says this is everything. and he shows this branching structure, which looks very much like Loki's branching structure from Loki season 1, but then also now flipped up, it also looks like a tree from Loki season 2. So kind of, it's somewhere in between the two, right? But anyway, he says, and these here, and shows these red lines, he says, this is all of us, all of our lives woven together in a beautiful web of life and destiny. And Miles says, the Spider-Verse. And Miguel's like, no, it's called an arachno-humanoid poly-multiverse. But notice what he called it there. Poly, meaning many, multiverse, many multiverses. Yeah, that's a megaverse, right? I mean, again, everyone's dancing around this term. It'll be interesting to see if it gets used or not. But the concept is still there. In fact, I think that's what Miguel is talking about right here with the Spider-Verse. We have Miles' universe, Spider-Gwen's universe, Peter B. Parker's universe. Each of those universes have branches, but tying them all together is the web of life and destiny. So we'll see. I don't know whether we're ultimately going to get this megaverse term or not, but the terminology should not hinder us. It's the concepts we really need to focus on. So, where did some of the confusion come from? Well, I find this interesting. Michael Waldron, who wrote Loki, Multiverse of Madness, and will be writing Avengers 5 at a minimum, maybe some of the others, in 2021 said this really interesting statement when talking about nexus points and branches. He said you could literally say they're all different universes, in a way, different timelines. So even back in 2021, we were seeing universe and timeline being used interchangeably. Interesting. But if you think about it, sacred universe doesn't sound as cool as sacred timeline, right? So I think they opted with the timeline wording in Loki because it just fit better. Then we look at what if. So this article also in 2021, A.C. Bradley had something to tell us. She's the main writer of Loki season 1 and 2. She said, when you're writing animation, you're writing so far in the future that you can't think 4 years down the line. The Doctor Strange episode, that best one from season 1, such a great episode. She says, I wrote it in February 2019. I think I should have called Nexus Point instead of Absolute Point, but the Loki scripts weren't even written yet. So that animaic locked before Loki even finished their scripts because you're always writing about 2 years ahead in animation. It's kind of intense and insane. So the key I want to show here is they're admitting that they actually had to write What If before Loki was even written. So the fact that some different terms are being used makes some sense. But that's an in real life explanation. Let's look at an in-universe explanation. I think what we're seeing is this, the story of the blind and the elephant, right? Where 3 different people blindfolded are trying to figure out what's in front of them. One touches the trunk and says it's a snake. Another touches its side and says it's a wall. And the last says, no, it's a rope. Because each of their own experience is rarely the whole truth, right? Well, I think that's what's happening with everybody describing the multiverse. I mean, He Who Remains was lying most of the time, right? But Peter, the Watcher, Reed, Hank, Dr. Strange, all of them are only seeing a piece of the bigger picture. They're trying their best to describe it, but they're only seeing their experience of the multiverse. It's kind of like how the Infinity Saga was this slow reveal. I mean, we didn't know that Loki's scepter was the Mind Stone for a while, quite a while, right? And that the Tesseract was the Space Stone. We knew them as the Tesseract and Loki's scepter. And then years later, really, is when we finally realized all the pieces coming together. I think that's what's happening with the Multiverse Saga as well. And I think this is the full picture. But again, we're going to test it as we walk through the rest of the chapters and the multiverse. So, Chapter 2, the Multiversal War. So, He Who Remains explains that he met his multiversal variants and that they came from universes stacked on top of his own. That is such an important statement to understand. Number one, they came from separate universes. And number two, they weren't connected to each other. They weren't branched off each other. They were stacked on top of each other. Okay, so we'll come back to that more later. Also, we learn that they brought the best of their universes to improve the others. So who were some of these variants? Well, I think 3 of them were the 3 that we see in the post-credit scene in Quantumania. I say that because ultimately, He Who Remains ends up mocking those 3 via the Timekeepers. I'm pretty sure these 3 were meant to be those 3 from the post-credit scene. Here they are as animatronics, and again, he's just basically mocking them. I think another one of the variants that are met originally is the one that ultimately is exiled in Quantumania. And of course, he really started to create problems for the others. He basically says, I saw their chaos, right? But Janet's like, you mean you started a war? And of course, he did, right? We see him wiping out timelines, killing tons of people. So ultimately, the others, all of me, he says, they exiled him down here because they're afraid of me. And Janet said he was exiled here in the quantum realm outside space and time because it was the only place that could hold him. So, since we've mentioned the quantum realm, let's talk a little bit about that. Is there only one quantum realm? Well, Jeff Loveness, the writer of Quantumania, said that it is the basement of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's multiverse. It's this connected limbo outside space and time. So basically, it touches all the different universes across the multiverse. Okay, that sounds great. So there's only one of them. But if that's true, then what about that first season What If episode where Janet contracts the zombie virus in the quantum realm? Did it branch the quantum realm? Well, obviously not. It couldn't have because there's only one. So, as we know, the quantum realm kind of does whatever they want it to do. So maybe, we can come up with different explanations, right? Maybe when the Nexus point occurred, it didn't branch the quantum realm, but it branched Janet in a way that the two variants were out of phase with each other. In other words, they didn't run across each other, but took off on their separate paths and each led, separate lives from there. It's possible that variants can never run into each other because the quantum realm is so big. There's a lot of ways to look at this, but the bottom line is we know there's only one, and the What If episode did not result in a branching of the actual quantum realm. Okay, so how does time work in the quantum realm? Well, we know it flows forward for people in it because Janet went in 1987, came out in 2018, so she aged 31 years while she was in there. But it's also possible that you fall into a time vortex. Remember, Ant-Man fell in one. It was only 5 hours for him when it was 5 years outside for everyone else. And on the flip side, the ants fell into a time vortex in Quantumania. They passed through some sort of time dilation, and they lived thousands of years in a single day. So that is important because I think that is going to explain why, when they exiled the Kang to the quantum realm hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it took him so long before he suddenly appeared when Janet was down there. So we'll talk more about that, but I really think these time vortexes answers a big, big question. All right, so then we lead to the Multiversal War. So the one Kang that was exiled has started this war. They got rid of him, but now they're all fighting. Notice the peace between realities. They're now calling it realities. I think He Who Remains, though, must be associating realities and universes as the same term because he said universes before. But it's kind of funny that Miss Minutes calls them timelines. In her propaganda video, Miss Minutes explains countless unique timelines battled each other for supremacy. So here we are seeing that timeline universe, being interchanged. Remember, Michael Waldron said they're basically the same thing. And then I think to the earlier point, remember with the elephant, it's all in the perspective of the person telling the story. What is the perspective they're trying to convey? And Miss Minutes was certainly trying to convey something different than He Who Remains. So that's important. All right, so what are the steps that He Who Remains took to basically take over the TVA, right? Well, the first thing was get a hold of this creature, right? Eliath, created from the tears in reality. Remember, he says, I harnessed the beast's power, began experimenting on it, and I weaponized it. I ended the Multiversal War. Now, it's important. He didn't say I won the war. He didn't say I killed everyone off, and that's how I won. He simply says I ended it. That's a very interesting phrasing. And then he uses another interesting phrase. I isolated our timeline. What does he mean by isolating? Well, Kate Herron, who directed the first season of Loki, explains he tells them in a story that he managed to close himself off and isolate the timeline that we all know from the other timelines. It's almost like they're an island that's completely hidden from everyone. So she's really clear here, if there was any doubt. He didn't kill the other Kangs. He isolated himself from them. Very interesting. And he kind of hints at that here in the end of Loki Season 1 when he says, you kill me, and the sacred timeline is completely exposed. Multiversal War. Now, that's not entirely true because we're going to learn the loom is still in place, even if he dies. And it has a failsafe. We'll get to that in a minute. But still, he's basically telling them the truth in that the sacred timeline will be exposed if the loom is gone. And he's more clear here. Now that he's revealed in Loki Season 2 all about the loom, he says, as you may or may not know, my variants are already out there. And that's those other Kangs, remember, from the post-credit scene in Quantumania. And then he says, the loom is what prevents a brutal war where nothing survives, Loki, not even the sacred timeline. Break the loom, you cause a war that kills us all, game over. So he's crystal clear. The loom is a protection device. It's exactly what Kate Herron was saying. He isolated himself and put himself on an island. And that's what the loom did for them. So, next step, after isolating the sacred timeline, create the TVA, right? And we learned that the timekeepers didn't create them, of course. Instead, they were kidnapped from the sacred timeline and their memories were erased. Yikes. And we're going to see just how much collateral they are as He Who Remains explains this. He says the temporal loom is a failsafe. That basically when the loom is overloaded with branches, it deletes the ones that aren't supposed to be there. Everything except the sacred timeline. As for the TVA, well, they're just collateral damage. Yikes. Let them all die. He couldn't care less. Look, it's no biggie. It's easy to rebuild. Yikes. So yeah, the TVA were totally expendable in He Who Remains' eyes. Step 4, after creating the TVA, now it's time to become the sole ruler. So he's talking to Ravonna, who helped him win the war. Ravonna helped him. But now he says, so it's almost ready. A utopia at the end of time for us. For all time, always. And she says, the TVA awaits our commands. Shall we go? He says, no, I'll catch up. It's been a long road. See you soon. And as soon as she leaves, erase all their memories. Yikes, including Ravonna's. So erase the TVA's, erase hers, and now he becomes the sole ruler. And then step 5, create a backup plan. So I firmly believe that he placed Victor Timely, young Victor Timely, which is a variant of himself, inside the sacred timeline as a backup plan that he could activate, kind of like a sleeper cell, right? And he had Miss Minutes ready to activate if necessary. Put this package in this window, that'll get Victor Timely activated and everything will be fine. Also, it's interesting to note that even the time slipping that he sent Loki through all throughout Loki Season 2, that was a backup plan as well. That, hey, who do you think paved the road, he said. So he had everything planned. He set up the sacred timeline, isolated it, created the TVA, became the sole ruler, and he even had backup plans for what to do. Wow. All right, so I want to look at this diagram because I think it really helps crystallize everything we've discussed. So I'm only going to show 5 universes here. We know there's tons of Kangs, but these are the main 5. You have the 3 universes that represent the 3 main Kangs from the post-credit scene. We have one for He Who Remains and one for the exiled Kang. So what ends up happening? Well, over time, branches form, right, off the timelines. And I think ultimately that's what allowed them to meet each other. Maybe there was even an incursion, but He Who Remains doesn't talk about that. So it might just been they were getting close enough to each other, because they are stacked, remember, on top of each other, that they discovered each other. That led to a war. So He Who Remains ultimately tames Goliath. But in the process, they get rid of this bad Kang, right? So they exile him to the quantum realm. I'm just going to make a poof there because I think he ended up inside a time vortex where he is now stuck and will stay there until Janet ultimately arrives in the quantum realm. So he may have been in that for hundreds of years. So then He Who Remains creates the loom. So now he has isolated himself from the other Kangs. He then isolates the sacred timeline down to the one main timeline that he can manage. And then he puts the TVA in charge, and he heads off to the Citadel and hangs out. So that's basically the Multiversal War and the result of it. So now we head on to chapter number 3, Life Inside the Protection of the Loom. So for this chapter, we're really looking at the Infinity Saga. And one of the questions that really came out of the Infinity Saga is, where did we get this 616 name? Where did that come from? Well, my guess is He Who Remains, when they were numbering the universes, landed on 616 for his universe. And maybe other Kangs came up with 1610. But you know how everybody loves to number things. I think He Who Remains ended up with 616. And he was quite proud of that number, so he stamped it everywhere. He had the TVA stamp it on all the video reels, like this one of Loki's life. It showed up on the timeline segments on the TemPad. You can see there, 616. Here's 616 again. And 616 again. And we also see it showing up when there's branches. So 616.44u. Blah, 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 blah. And again, we see it here during a pruned timeline. So does that mean that the TVA is aware that there was a multiverse? No, I don't think so. I think they were just told by He Who Remains, by the timekeepers, however you look at it. They were told, stamp everything with 616. They're a government organization, so they did what they were told. Simple as that. But I also think that He Who Remains may well have put his own Easter eggs, if you will, in the sacred timeline, like a signature of his existence. So Dr. Selvig, if you can kind of move out of the way, great, thank you. So notice on his board, I think Dr. Selvig, doing his research, found some of those, signatures that He Who Remains left of the 616. It was a hint by He Who Remains, this is 616, I'm proud of it. I think also Selvig then theorized some other multiversal things. Notice he theorized the nexus of all reality, the fault, the crossroads, etc. So Dr. Selvig definitely was on to this idea that there could be a multiverse. I also have to wonder, did Mysterio look at his research and see the 616 universe and this idea of the multiverse? Is that where Mysterio came up with it? Very interesting. That's certainly a possibility. Heck, even Christine in Multiverse of Madness may have looked at Dr. Selvig's research and learned about 616. Who knows? But anyway, I think that's where 616 came from. But a bigger question is, during the Infinity Saga, how did we have a multiverse? Right? Remember, the loom is in place. They're pruning all the timelines. Yet, Ancient One is saying, who are you in this vast multiverse, Mr. Strange? They're even showing us some visuals that kind of looks like timelines, right? His fingers turning into fingers, turning into fingers. Ugh, that's so gross. So, what is the explanation for this? Well, actually, Kevin Feige himself may have given us an explanation. He did an interview, and he talked about this situation. He said, our interpretation of the multiverse and various dimensions will basically be seen in the Doctor Strange movie, right? But notice he's talking about various dimensions, and he brings them up here again. Parallel dimensions, multiple dimensions. He talks about the quantum realm and how the quantum realm is another dimension. And then he's really clear at this point in the interview. He says dimensions are not just parallel realities. We're playing as much with the notion of the multiverse as much as alien dimensions, for lack of a better term, rather than parallel realities where there's a Doctor Strange that wears Iron Man armor. We're not there yet. Interesting. So he's basically saying the multiverse, at least during the Infinity Saga, is multiple dimensions, quantum realm, dark dimension, etc., Valhalla. I don't know why they did that. I don't know. Why did he call it the multiverse? I don't know. But he is explaining himself. He's not talking about variants. He's talking about different dimensions. Here again, he says, we're tapping into the notion of the multiverse of dimensions right next to our own. Well, there you go. That's our answer. But then something else that's strange. Why was the Watcher hanging around during the Infinity Saga? This clip here, this is from the Watcher watching I Am Groot. Remember, in the second season of I Am Groot, last episode, Watcher showed up. Well, he was watching Groot. That's interesting, right? Plus, we saw Watchers in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. In fact, we didn't just see this one, we saw 3 of them, and their Watcher assistant, the late, great R.I.P. Stan Lee, who, of course, they desert and leave behind. So I really want What If Season 3 to explain, how did the Watcher feel about this period of time? I mean, imagine being the Watcher and seeing a Nexus event occur and then seeing the TVA jump in and prune it. He'd be like, oh, come on. Come on, you're killing me. These are my stories and you're messing them up. So instead he has to hang around and look at what Groot's doing. It's just kind of funny. But anyway, I really, really hope they go into that. But we do know the Watcher was around during the period of the Loom, during the Infinity Saga. Also during the Infinity Saga, that's the point when Janet is in the quantum realm the first time around, and notice who comes flying out of their time vortex centuries after he was probably sent into the quantum realm. None other than Kang, the exiled Kang. So he says, after so many years alone, it's nice to have a friend. But of course, Janet ultimately figures out who is Kang, because she realizes he's really bad. She sabotages his ship, and she takes off and gets out of the quantum realm. So pretty much, again, we're talking about the Infinity Saga, everything that happens in the Infinity Saga. So back to our diagram, we'll update this a little bit. Notice we got the loom in place, the blue loom there. So Janet, in 1987, ends up in the quantum realm. We learn about that, in the first Ant-Man movie. And then I'm picking 2008. It's really not clear when in the timeline this happens, but at some point during her exile, she runs into Kang because he comes out of his poof. So she spends some time with him, helps him rebuild his machine, and then realizes he's bad, ends up destroying his machine, which we'll pick up then again in Quantumania, but she gets out in 2018. So one also thing I do want to mention, because this will lead right into our next chapter, is there isn't really just a single sacred timeline. Instead, we're going to find out there's actually multiple that are being woven into the loom. But that takes us to our next chapter. Chapter 4, Time Travel and Nexus Events. So we're now dealing with the tail end of the Infinity Saga, i.e. Endgame, and in particular, the introduction of time travel. So the Hulk explains if you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. So it's a very simple explanation, but it's still a little wordy and a little hard to understand, perhaps. But basically, you go to the past, and it creates a branch. It creates a new timeline. And Scott Lang confirmed that in his canon book, because this book is canon to the MCU, where he says they picked specific points on alternate timelines, jumped to those timelines, and grabbed the stones. Now, I'm pretty sure that what he really did is they went back in time and it created an alternate timeline. But regardless, the key is they were in different timelines. And in fact, we even saw in X-Men 97 how Cable was discussing every time he went back in time and tried over and over again, notice all of this branching. So even the X-Men timeline seems to branch. And that surprised me because I always assumed it was more the Back to the Future logic. But no, they're branching. And if you think about it, Endgame had to branch. I mean, they went back and they knocked out Star-Lord, which would make it too late for him to go pick up the Power Stone in time. Future Captain America told past Captain America, Bucky's alive. Captain America also told Sitwell, Hail Hydra. And of course, they created a new Loki, which built a new branch off of that. So yeah, they have to be creating branches. And the single most clear point to me is Gamora. I mean, they go back to 2014, and then the Gamora and Thanos and Nebula, for that matter, from 2014 jump forward to 2023. Well, if they weren't in a branch, then that would have been the ones from the main timeline, and that's impossible. They obviously were the ones from a branch created because they went back in time. So I also therefore believe that Captain America created a branch with Peggy, and I do understand that the writers of Endgame have a disagreement with the directors. The directors think it created a branch. The writers think it was the main timeline. I hope Marvel gives us a definitive answer at some point, but for consistency, I don't see how this couldn't have also created a branch. But then the question is, how do you get back to your own timeline? Well, I'm going to turn to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. because Fitz gives a crystal clear explanation. You went back in time, you branched off, but we can travel back through something called the quantum realm. We can go between timelines. Beautifully said. I mean, that's also what they did in Endgame, but man, he just nailed it right there. So, I really want to see how Captain America returned these Infinity Stones. Please, Marvel, would you give us this special presentation? Please, because the Ancient One said if you remove one of the stones, the time flow splits, okay? We get a split in time. But then Bruce says, well, that's no problem. We can return each one to its own timeline at the moment it was taken. Okay, then, Marvel, show us that. I want to see Captain America returning the stone to the Ancient One. I want to see him returning the one to the Red Skull. Please, please, I want to see that. So hopefully we'll get that at some point. But nonetheless, theoretically, that's how they erased all of these timelines, is they returned the stones. So then, how did Miss Marvel impact her own timeline then? Because she didn't create a branch. That's crystal clear. Well, the writer said, I think it wouldn't have created a Nexus event, a branch, because of the inevitability of it. So it was a closed loop. Interesting. I don't know why she's saying that, because we'd never seen closed loops before, right? Well, she says this fascinating thing. She says it fits into the logic of what was established in the TVA. I don't know why she's saying that, because Loki season 1, that's not what happened. They always created branches. However, in Loki season 2, the time slipping did let him create closed loops. So ironically, I think she knew what was coming in Loki season 2, so she was like, oh, well then I can do a closed loop as well. And then from there it got a little bit confusing. But still, I think she's right. We do see closed loops in Loki season 2 if your time travel is with Kang Tech. And I think her bracelets are Kang Tech. We'll find out, but I really think that's going to be the case. All right, so then we also learned, though, about absolute points in time, that you can't always go back in time to try to erase it, because Doctor Strange, using the Time Stone, tried to go back in time. However, the Ancient One explained, without Christine's demise, Strange doesn't become a sorcerer, doesn't defeat Dormammu, and doesn't gain access to the Time Stone to come back in the first place. Thus, destroying an absolute point and altering his own timeline won't just create a branch, instead it would lead to the destruction of his own reality. Absolutely my favorite episode of What If. Such a good episode. If you haven't seen it, you got to check it out. But also we see absolute points mentioned even in X-Men 97, because Beast says the mystics of Kamar-Taj speak of absolute points, events that occur across all timelines. So I love this consistency of this terminology going across all these different shows. Love it. And you could argue the Spider-Verse canon events are the same thing, because they say, and these nodes where the lines converge, they are the canon. Chapters that are part of every Spider's story every time. I mean, that's kind of an absolute point. It must happen, at least according to Miguel. Now, we'll find out in Beyond the Spider-Verse if maybe he's not so correct about these canon events. But for now, they're very similar to absolute points in time. So, I love this quote then from Michael Waldron to kind of summarize all this. He says, you know what? I realized that time travel basically is the multiverse. So he's basically saying, hey, once I saw what they did in Endgame, I realized I can take that to dive into Loki and create Nexus events. So he's saying basically, hey, if that's how this works, if we create Nexus events and it creates a new timeline, super. I'm going to show that you don't have to go back in time to do that. It can just simply be a decision that creates a new Nexus point. And we see that in What If, right? The Watcher explains a single choice can branch out into infinite realities. So while it's not time travel creating these branches, interestingly, Endgame allowed the writers essentially to go, oh, we can do this too. This is so cool. So thus was created this idea of these Nexus points. And this is really key. I alluded to this in the last chapter. We find out the sacred timeline isn't just one timeline after all. It's actually multiple timelines. Because when they go to the temporal loom room, they discover that it's the heart of the TVA, right? It's where raw time is refined into physical timelines, but it's not constructed to weave together so many branches, and thus it's overloading. But here's the key. If it's weaving more than one branch, then obviously there are multiple timelines. So if there are multiple timelines, why? Why is there more than one? We learn there's just a sacred timeline. Why would there be more than one timeline? Well, once again, turn to Michael Waldron. This dude gives so many good quotes. So he says, and that's just how time works. There's always like different permutations and instances happening. The TVA has their own barometer, their own gauge of what constitutes a deviation from the baseline, and that's the way it's supposed to go. The way that produces the He Who Remains. That's their baseline. So, he then says, if you zoomed in on the timeline, it wouldn't necessarily look like a straight line. It might look like the intertwined strands of a rope, fluctuating and spiking here or there. What I love about this is, this interview he gave in 2021, so well before Loki Season 2 when we learned about the loom, and yet he was still pointing out that the sacred timeline is really intertwined strands of rope. And you know what? That's what they showed us. If you look at Loki Season 1 at the Citadel at the end of time, notice those are multiple strands, not just one strand. We didn't realize it was the loom at that point because from the Citadel, it didn't look like a loom. I think the only time you actually see the loom is when you're standing in the loom room. I don't know what else to call it. But anyway, I love the fact that even in 2021, they were talking about the fact that it was intertwined strands of rope. So that raises the question then, what are they pruning? If there's actually more than one timeline in the sacred timeline, quote unquote, what are they pruning? So Loki asks that, what are you afraid of? And he says, me. So basically he's pruning any time a new He Who Remains would be created. And in fact, Loki picks up on that and explains to Mobius, maybe it's true. Maybe everything he was doing, the pruning, the preservation of the sacred timeline was just about preventing more of him. So he only pruned it when it was more of him being created, which, by the way, even back in 2021 is exactly what Michael Waldron said. When it becomes a problem for the TVA is when, according to their own rules, when something could branch off in a way that could actually produce a new timeline that could produce a new version of He Who Remains. Man, crazy. I mean, it really all fits. These interviews are not canon, obviously. It's just a writer talking to somebody in an interview. But it fits with what we learn in all these series. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. But a very good question is, okay, then how did we get all these Loki variants? If we're talking about one sacred timeline that's branching off, we shouldn't have this many different variants. Well, first of all, Mobius does confirm every single Loki came from the sacred timeline, because he says, when we get out on the branch from the sacred timeline, keep in mind, we're not just looking for a time criminal, we're looking for a Loki. So he's establishing every Loki comes from a branch off the sacred timeline. But how? How then do they look so different? I think Sylvie gave us the answer. She said the universe wants to break free, so it manifests chaos. The bottom line is the universe does not want to be unnaturally contained inside a loom. It does not like being pruned. That's the bottom line. So the universe creates chaos, and that chaos is like me being born as the goddess of mischief. So in other words, every Loki is chaos. It is the universe creating all these different variants with the hope that eventually they will break the universe free. And in fact, they do, right? Because Mobius says, two variants of the same being, especially you, forming this kind of sick, twisted relationship, that's pure chaos. That could break reality. And that's my point. This was the universe's way of trying to break free. And then I love this. If you look at Loki season 2, Ravonna says, all that matters is order versus chaos. I'm order. And Mobius screams no, because all of a sudden, who pops in but chaos? So you can come up with your own theories. There's many ways to explain why there's different Loki variances. I just like the idea that the Loki variants are created by the universe itself trying to escape the loom. I just think that's cool. But anyway, another question people ask, and this is a very fair one, is how do you get so many Infinity Stones if, again, there's only one sacred timeline and there's branches off of it? There should be no more than 6, right? 6 Infinity Stones, that's it. Well, think about it. Yeah, I know, Casey says we actually get a lot of these, and some of these guys use them as paperweights, so we have a whole ton of them, right? But every time a variant is pruned that has in their possession an Infinity Stone, like Loki, remember he was pruned holding the Time Stone, the Space Stone. So they take with them the Space Stone, right? Well, every time they prune someone that has an Infinity Stone, that would be yet another for their collection. So over time, because they've been doing this for hundreds of years, they've probably pruned lots of people holding an Infinity Stone at the time. Maybe not holding it in their hand, but you know what I'm saying. They had in their possession an Infinity Stone. Thus, you get a whole bunch of them. So I think that makes sense. So the key is, it is a sacred timeline, one universe with lots of branches coming off of it, and they prune them anytime they would create a new He Who Remains. So let's bring our little diagram up to speed here a little bit more. Last time we left off was during the Infinity Saga with Janet returning back in 2018. So now we jump to the time heist. 2023, of course, they jump back in time to multiple time periods, but we're going to focus on 2012 because that's the key one where they're in 2012 for a while, but during their time there, they create an additional branch. And that additional branch results in a Loki who gets taken to the TVA. Then the TVA prunes that particular branch, but the original one still remains, and the time heist ultimately ends, and they get back to 2023, and then somehow, Steve Rogers returns the stones and erases them all. Again, Marvel, please, we really, really want to see this. But so now we are up to the point where Endgame has completed, and now we're ready to head into the next chapter, which is Chapter 5, Loki against the TVA. So this chapter is basically Loki Season 1, which I know we've all seen probably multiple times. So I'm going to summarize it at a very high level. And in fact, we've talked up to this point a lot about the Timekeepers, the TVA, the pruning, the Nexus events, etc. So all I want to talk about here is what is essentially the whole point of Loki Season 1. And that is that He Who Remains controls the path of Loki and Sylvie until they reach him and he can give them an ultimatum. So we see him controlling their path because they initially fight each other, then they kind of reluctantly team up, and they even have a little bit of a romantic adventure on Lamentus. Then they finally reach Alioth, who they enchant together so they can get past Alioth and ultimately to reach He Who Remains and to get that ultimatum. They're given a choice. You either take over and my life's work continues, or you plunge a blade in my chest and an infinite amount of me start another multiversal war. But then he says something interesting. We just crossed the threshold. So what exactly is this threshold? We hear thunder outside and he says, oh. And then as the branches are forming, he says, I have no idea how the rest of this is going to go. So while they never really tell us what the threshold is, so any theory is valid, I'll tell you my theory is when he says it is right when these branches are forming and slowly getting out of control. Well, why are they forming? Well, because back in the TVA, Mobius and B-15 have finally, grown a conscience and decided they're no longer going to prune these branches. They're killing variants just like themselves. So they've stopped. They basically rebel against He Who Remains. Mobius says, no turning back now. Who said anything about turning back, says B-15. So they have basically rebelled and stopped doing their job. I think that is why there is a threshold. So now we wait to see what are Loki and Sylvie going to do. Well, they obviously fight each other for a while, but then Loki is pushed through a time door by Sylvie, and it's a time door that was opened by He Who Remains TempPad. And that is really important because I think it was programmed with the time slipping. Because when Loki in Loki Season 2 finally gets back to He Who Remains, says basically, who do you think paved that road? Loki knows about the time slipping now, but it was He Who Remains who did it. So the time slipping essentially takes Loki into the TVA's past, and we'll pick up on Loki in the next chapter when we get to Loki Season 2. What about Sylvie, though? Well, Sylvie does decide to kill He Who Remains, obviously plunges that blade in his chest, and then she takes off to go live in what I like to call the McDonald's branch, which again, we'll pick up on her when we get to Loki Season 2 in the next chapter. So let's just summarize these main points. I mean, again, there's so much that happens in the season, but the main points are that Loki is captured by the TVA. Eventually, he and Sylvie meet up. They reach Alioth, they enchant Alioth, and then they reach He Who Remains. They fight, and Sylvie pushes Loki through the time door, which causes the time slipping and sending him into the past. Sylvie then kills He Who Remains. While all the branches now are going crazy because they're no longer pruning, obviously, Sylvie takes off to go live in the McDonald's branch, and poor Loki has to deal with a loom that is now falling apart. So I'm going to switch it, as you can see, to dotted lines because the loom is now, slowly disintegrating. And that, of course, is going to lead us into Loki Season 2. So, Chapter 6, The Failing of the Loom. So this chapter is most of Loki Season 2, which again, I'm sure we've all seen multiple times, so I will summarize at a very high level by saying that it basically involves Loki realizing over and over again that the loom cannot be fixed, that the branching, left uncontrolled, because they're no longer pruning it, made the loom in a state where it cannot be fixed. So we see them trying multiple times, right? Be brave. You're being so brave, he says to Victor Timely, who heads out there on the platform and gets spaghettified over and over again. So Loki realizes there just isn't a solution for fixing the loom. And his fix for it, his ultimate fix, we'll get to in the next chapter. But what I want you to see here is, while all this is going on, while the loom is fracturing and fraying and splintering and cracking, a lot is happening in the main MCU. So we learned from Marvel when they released a season-by-season breakdown of all of the different TV shows. Notice, Loki Season 1 is right after Endgame, no surprise there, but Loki Season 2 does not end until after the Marvels. So yeah, they're basically saying the loom, the cracking loom, remember the dotted blue lines, that is in place, slowly falling apart during essentially the entire multiverse saga up to this point. So that means that all of the movies that deal with the multiverse are happening while the loom is in place, but has cracks letting the multiverse in and out. So what do we think about that? I mean, does it make sense that Loki Season 1 and Season 2 are running parallel to other events? Well, the timeline book, notice, shows us that Loki Season 1, that's the green bar there, has events happening while Endgame is going on, but then, even further, has events happening right before, WandaVision happens. So, yeah, the timeline book is even saying Loki Season 1 is happening parallel to other events, so therefore Loki Season 2 would as well. So, does time flow then in the TVA? That seems a little confusing, right? I mean, I remember in the first season when Loki said, "How long have you been here?" to Mobius. Mobius says, "I don't know. It's hard to say. Time passes differently here in the TVA." But in Loki season 2, after he stops time slipping, Loki stands before Mobius, and Mobius says, "What do you mean you've been in the past? Where?" "Here, the past TVA," says Loki. "No, there is no past TVA," says Mobius. "Time doesn't work like that here." And Loki says, "It does. It's happening to me." So the very fact that he could time slip into the past, and many different points of the past, even the future at some points, shows there must be some flow of time. So look at the fact that he goes back to OB, and OB says it's impossible to time slip in the TVA in the past. He's telling that to Loki. And then in the future, if you will, he says, "A long time ago, he came to me complaining about time slipping." A long time ago. That definitely says there's a flow of time, right? And the fact that they create a temporal aura extractor in the past, and then sure enough, it shows up in, let's call it the present, again, shows the flow of time. Look at the fact that Sylvie says, "I had to pull a memory from hundreds of years prior, before she had even fought for them," referring to before they became TVA agents and when they were still in the sacred timeline. Hundreds of years, though, have passed since that. Okay, that's a flow of time. OB mentions 400 years passing. Clearly, there's a flow of time, right? Ravonna says eons of friendship, which implies time. He Who Remains says eons ago before the TVA. Even the lunch breaks are limited to 17 minutes, which I know it's kind of a jokey poster, but it still implies there must be a flow of time or you wouldn't be limited to 17 minutes. I would even argue that time twisters that we see used in season 1 reference time. I realize they're a spatial device. They move you spatially to a different location, but it's a location you were at in the past. So it can't even work if it can't tap into where you were in the past. So the bottom line is time does seem to flow in the TVA. It flows very differently, but it does flow. So while Loki season 2 is going on, this loom is cracking and fraying and falling apart, but because it's still intact, but does have cracks in it, that's what's allowing the multiverse in. So I've shown this image before in other videos. Essentially, let's call this the cracked loom here. So Loki season 1, and then the loom falling apart all the way up to the tree, which we'll get to in the next chapter. Because it's cracking, that allows things like No Way Home, the Spider-Man, to come in and out. It allows Multiverse of Madness with the Illuminati. It allows traveling to see the Beast in the Marvels, and of course, the Kang Council in Quantumania. And really, this goes with this important quote from Feige, when Feige said, "He who remains is gone," and that allowed a spell to go wrong in Spider-Man No Way Home, which leads to the entire multiverse going quite mad in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And if he continued talking about future events, he would have mentioned, oh, and also that whole thing in the Marvels with the Beast. It allowed that too, because the loom is still in place even when the Marvels is occurring. Now, Kevin Feige didn't go into details on the loom because we hadn't got to Loki season 2 yet, and that hadn't been revealed. But he's still right. He Who Remains was killed. The branching was no longer, being pruned. It was branching out of control, cracking the loom, and all of these different things are happening. And so we just have to understand that, strange as it may seem, while this is going on in the main in Loki season 2, in the main MCU, time is passing as well, and adventures are occurring. And I think this one really solidifies it. If we look at Quantumania, when they get back home again, or right before they get home, Janet says, "I think I can give us one shot back." And what does she pull up? The sacred timeline with its branches. So clearly the loom is still in place, and Loki's tree has not yet happened, which of course we'll get to in the next chapter. But notice she kind of rifles through the different timelines, trying to find the one she wants. She finally picks the one she wants, then says, "I want to go to here on the planet Earth," particularly where they want to go home. She loads it into the device, creates the portal, and sure enough, they get home. So this has to be happening before the tree was created, so therefore during Loki season 2. So, speaking of Quantumania, what happened to this guy anyway, the Quantumania Kang? I mean, does anybody really think he's dead? I don't think he's dead. In fact, I think he's going to come back as the Beyonder, or a type of Beyonder. Certainly he won't look like that, but he's going to come back as the Beyonder, probably as part of Secret Wars. So we'll see. Maybe Marvel goes a different direction with the situation with Majors, but it does seem like they are recasting and keeping Kang around. Who knows? Maybe they'll even bring Majors back. Seems unlikely. But regardless, I don't think the Kang storyline is gone. I do think we're going to see this guy again. And while we're talking about him, what about the Kang Council at the end of Quantumania? Who exactly are they referring to when they talk about the Exiled One? So they say, the Exiled One is dead. Are you sure he's dead? If it wasn't true, I wouldn't call you. Must really eat you up that you're not the one who killed him. And that's very important. They wanted to kill him. Keep that in mind. Well, none of us did. They did. They're beginning to touch the multiverse. And if we let them, they will take everything we've built. So, who are they referring to when they talk about the Exiled One? Because I think this is really important to understanding what's going on in Loki Season 2 with the loom falling apart, etc. So, obviously, they bring in the whole Kang Council. They're all hooting and hollering there. But let's go over these facts. All right, so who are they referring to? So the Kang Council, the main Kang Council representatives there, they call him the Exiled One. They know he's dead. They wanted to kill him, and his death means they are beginning to touch the multiverse. So, are they referring to the Kang from Quantumania? Well, definitely throughout Quantumania, Kang himself refers to himself as the Exiled One. So, okay, yeah, they exiled him. That works. But do they know he's dead? Maybe. I don't know if they can see what's in the quantum realm, though. They basically just exiled him to the quantum realm and wrote him off. They didn't even care what happened to him, right? And this is important. They said they wanted to kill him. Well, if they wanted to kill him, why did they send him to the quantum realm? It wouldn't make sense for them to be referring to the Kang from Quantumania. They would have just killed him up front. I don't think they wanted to kill their own people. They didn't want to kill their own Kang variants. They maybe had a rule against it. But they also say his death means they are beginning to touch the multiverse. Well, did anyone in Quantumania, any of the Ant family, if you will, Scott and Hope and Janet, etc., did they really touch the multiverse? Not really. In fact, when Scott got back to the main universe again, he didn't even know what happened. He was like, did that work or not? I don't really know. So, no, they didn't really touch the multiverse in Quantumania. On the other hand, are they referring to He Who Remains? So, they call him the Exiled One. Yeah, he did kind of exile himself, right? He Who Remains, remember, won the Multiversal War and hid behind the loom on an island. They referred to it at one point. Kate Herron did. So, yeah, he is an Exiled One. They know he's dead. They definitely know he's dead now because the cracks in the loom allow them to see in, and they realize, oh my goodness, he's been killed. They wanted to kill him. Oh, yeah, they wanted to kill him. They definitely did. But they weren't able to because, remember, he weaponized Goliath, used him as a pit bull, and ran away and isolated himself in the loom. So they wanted to kill him, for sure. They were really mad at him. And then his death means they're beginning to touch the multiverse. Yeah, Loki and Sylvie basically reached the Citadel at the end of time and killed a Kang variant. Wow. So, yeah, I think if you look at the list that they're definitely talking about He Who Remains. Let me know your thoughts on that. But yeah, just an interesting point to discuss. All right, so now let's go back to our diagram, and I'm going to fill in especially the parts about Janet. So remember when we left, the loom was falling apart. That's the dotted lines there. And so now in 2026, Janet and all of them head into the quantum realm, and they meet that Kang, who's been really mad when Janet left and destroyed his device. So they obviously help him fix the device, but in the process, he ends up seemingly dying, right? We don't know what happened to him. And then they head back to 2026. They get out of the quantum realm. And now we see that the Kang Council is able to look in, see that He Who Remains is dead. I think they're referring to him as the Exiled One. And of course, they call the main council into play. So I do think Marvel is going to continue with this story, even in Avengers 5, with some of the Kangs taking on the Avengers. We'll just have to wait and see. But what is Loki going to do with the loom? He's realized now he cannot fix it. So, what's the next step? Well, that would be Chapter 7. Loki's tree is born. So we learned throughout all of Loki Season 2 that there simply was no solution for the loom. The branches of time are duplicating and expanding at an infinite rate. And the loom will always fail. And remember, when the loom fails, it resets back to just being the sacred timeline, it wipes out all the extra branches, and it wipes out the TVA in the process, right? So if they want to allow the sacred timeline to continue to branch without being pruned, they've got to get it outside of the loom, where it's been protected up to this point, but the loom is going to reset it every single time if they don't get it outside the loom. because the loom will never be able to accommodate for an infinitely growing multiverse. You can't scale for infinite. But isn't it interesting they use the term multiverse? Like, up to this point, they've just referred to everything inside the loom as branches, timelines, those type of things. Now they're suddenly referring to collectively those things as a multiverse? So do they mean like everything in the multiverse? Like, are they including the animated universe and the cube universe and the black and white universe? And I love the paint universe, but I don't think they're talking about that. In fact, I don't think they even know these universes exist. There's a greater multiverse out there, and that's not what they're talking about. What they're doing is realizing those little squiggles on their monitors that they used to be pruning, those aren't just squiggles. Those are universes with real people on them. I mean, look at the answers they give throughout Season 2 when asked about pruning. Doc says, and under whose authority did you make the call to stop pruning branches? And B-15 says, we haven't been protecting, we've been destroying. There are people with lives on those branches, and we have committed atrocities every time we prune. When OB says we need to prune these extra branches, B-15 says that means the death of countless people. We can't do that. So basically, if you go back to that diagram, remember, of everybody feeling different parts of the elephant and they couldn't see the whole thing? Well, the characters in Loki are starting to see more of the big picture because they're realizing the branches, the timelines, are really universes, and collectively they make up a multiverse. And in fact, it really goes back to this quote that Michael Waldron had way back in 2021 when he said, the different universes are, in a way, different timelines. So he's saying it here, but now the characters in the show, so B-15, Loki, etc., they're realizing those are really universes, and collectively they are a multiverse. So Loki realizes, I got to do something. This loom ain't working, so he shuts down the loom, destroys it. That leaves all the branches that were being fed by the loom now dying. So he decides, I got to bring them back to life, right? So he tries to bring one back to life, but when he takes his hand away, they die again. So he realizes, I'm going to have to do this myself. I'm going to have to make a big sacrifice play. So he grabs all the branches, takes one last longing look back at his old life, and then he heads up the steps, goes to the throne, sits down, grabs those branches, and literally plugs them into himself, like plants them in himself. He is now the dirt for the new multiversal tree, because slowly it forms, and sure enough, now we have Loki's tree, the 616 multiversal tree, because it is the sacred timeline and all of its branched universes. But should we be calling it a multiversal tree? I mean, the characters did, right? I mean, Victor Timely said it's a multiverse. Well, I think this is fascinating. So Bo DeMaio, who writes for X-Men 97, was asked a question on Twitter. Bo, does the fixed points in time, which was mentioned in X-Men 97, does that mean X-Men 97 is part of the MCU multiverse? Well, Bo says, I think at this point we're merely using common language and we're not necessarily connected on the same tree. He goes on to say, I think it's very much dealer's choice on some levels. I know all my discussions were to view it as its own neighboring tree. So X-Men 97 is a neighboring tree, not a branch on the multiverse MCU tree. I mean, he's basically calling it, calling it a multiverse MCU tree. Now, I realize this is just one writer on one show, but he says it was from my discussions. So I'm imagining that was coming down from above, ultimately from Feige, of this is how we need to refer to this. It is a multiversal tree, 616, and its branched universes, a multiversal tree. And in fact, that fits perfectly with what the Watcher's been saying all along. Ironically, What If really had the right terminology because it is the 616 multiverse, and he is observing new universes being created. This right here is a new universe literally being created. He, being Doctor Strange, recreated this universe but was never born into it. So, yeah, the terminology in What If is really the right terminology, it seems, that there's a 616 universe and it has branched universes, and together, that is the 616 multiverse. In fact, we see it here, right? He goes outside the tree, and sure enough, we see the same Loki tree. That's the same thing that he's been watching and referring to all along as a multiverse. I love it. It's really perfect. But it does raise an interesting question. Does that mean that What If is an animated universe? Because we know that 616, the main 616 is live action, but What If is animated? I mean, we've seen actual animated universes. Is What If animated? Okay, it's a great question, but I would say no. Sometimes it's just a creative choice to show things as animation. Like this right here. This is from I Am Groot Season 2, which obviously I Am Groot is in the live action main 616, yet here we see the Watcher in animated form watching. And in fact, a better example is in Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, we have a flashback that's animated. Obviously, they didn't suddenly turn into animated characters at this point. It was a creative choice to show it animated. So What If is likewise a creative choice to show it in animated form, even though it's really live action. Another great example is Werewolf by Night. I don't think it's a black and white universe, and in fact, I think the Timeline book makes that clear because this is a picture from the Timeline book showing that it's actually a live action and, most importantly, color universe, not black and white. So sometimes there are creative choices to show something in black and white, and other times, like the noir universe, it actually is black and white. So very, very interesting. All right, so let's go back one last time to our diagram as we've been tracking through the multiverse here. So remember, we left with Loki, and the loom is falling apart, slowly disintegrating. So Loki makes the call, I got to shut it down. And of course, when he shuts it down, that leaves the branches dying, and so Loki has to grab them, pull them into himself, and he creates the new multiversal tree. Also, the new TVA is formed, and we're going to talk about them in the very next chapter. But one last thing I want to point out is because they're no longer pruning, I think we're going to see branches continue to form and maybe start to overlap between different universes. So one of the Kang universes, for example, that may start causing incursions, and we will also talk about those in an upcoming chapter. Chapter 8, Life After Loki's Tree. So what is life like now that Loki's tree has been formed? Well, there's a new mission for the TVA. We see their poster, Let's Grow Together, and it's the tree just, growing away, no longer being pruned, which is great. We see all of them in the control room working as a team. In fact, look at the monitor in the center. We see what looks like Loki's tree there, growing upwards and then outwards infinitely. Awesome. Then they start talking about getting reports on the variants of He Who Remains. They say, do any of them know that we exist yet? And the answer is no. So who are they talking about here? Notice they didn't call them Kangs. That's interesting. But who are we talking about? Well, I don't think we're talking about these guys, the main Kang Council, and nor are they talking about any of those Kangs in the Coliseum of Kangs that we saw in the Quantumania post-credit. Wherever they're located, they are outside the MCU multiversal tree, hidden away. So who are they referring to then? Well, remember, when the loom was in place, they did prune stuff. And why did they prune it? Because some of those branches inside the loom could have formed a new He Who Remains. Well, likewise, now that they have a multiversal tree that's not being pruned, some of those branches in the tree could become a branch with a He Who Remains. So that's what I think they're monitoring. Anytime a new He Who Remains pops up inside the multiversal tree. And so far, none of them caused trouble. Well, they do say, though, one of them caused a little bit of a ruckus on 616 Adjacent Realm. So that's interesting. Why did they call it 616 Adjacent Realm? Well, if you think about it, the quantum realm, there's only one for the multiverse, right? It's basically adjacent to everything. So it is adjacent to the MCU multiversal tree. That's why they're referring to it as an adjacent realm. It's right next to the tree, effectively. And they said they handled it, so we're good for now. So one of their missions is definitely to keep an eye on their Loki's tree, the multiversal tree, for the MCU to make sure no new He Who Remains pop up, and if so, they keep an eye on them. So we also see them all working together in the war room as a team. That's awesome. Love that. Meanwhile, Ravonna, what's up with her, right? We last saw her in the void, just laying there. She sits up. She sees a pyramid and a sphinx, which does kind of make you think Ramatut's Kang might show up. Somebody does show up. We don't know who. Hard to tell if she's excited, scared. We don't know. We don't know what her fate is. So that's a good open question. And then we have Loki. Loki's, helping the tree grow and kind of stuck right now. So will he ever get out? I mean, I hope so. I hope he gets to see Thor at some point. I want those two to reunite. So that'll be down the road, though. And then we have the Watcher. Watcher's very busy now, keeping an eye on the tree because so many branches are forming. Of course, What If Season 3 is coming out. Can't wait for that. That should be really good. And then, meanwhile, over in the X-Men universe. So we learned from Bo DeMaio that at least X-Men 97 is somewhere separate from the MCU multiversal tree. So I can only imagine that the X-Men universe is also separate from the MCU multiversal tree. It's its own tree, or not a tree, as we're going to see in a second. It's a mess. But that's why I think this is a separate TVA, and Paradox is running it. I don't know who formed the TVA. We're going to have to find that out in Deadpool and Wolverine. But I really think it's a separate TVA, and Paradox here is showing Wade the MCU. He's basically tantalizing him with it because he knows that Wade wants to go to the MCU. And how is he able to do that? Well, Paradox is able to show Wade the MCU because Loki's tree is now exposed to the entire multiverse. It's like this beautiful North Star shining in the sky. So I think that's how Paradox is able to show the multiversal tree, and he's basically tempting Wade, saying, hey, I'll send you there if you'll do some work for me. So what do I think Paradox wants him to do? Well, look at the monitor on the far right. I think that, in fact, I'll blow it up here, that is the X-Men timeline, which I think we're going to learn actually does branch. You know, it looked like in Days of Future Past and in Deadpool 2 that it was Back to the Future logic, it was rewriting. I think this is showing us that instead it's been branching this whole time. So that is the X-Men universe. Remember, the TVA monitoring the MCU looks like that, a nice, beautiful tree. So that's why it just seems like this has got to be a different TVA, or something strange is definitely going on. We'll learn more for sure in the movie right around the corner. But we also know that Deadpool is going to be pruned and sent to the void. And I do think there's only one void for the entire multiverse. I say that because in this void, we see Easter eggs from the MCU, there's the Chitauri, and also from the X-Men universe. That's from Last Stand. And here we see a helicarrier from the MCU. So it seems like the void is the dumping ground across the entire multiverse for all the different universes. You know, they just keep dumping stuff into the void. So, okay, great. We also see Eliath. I think it's the same Eliath that we saw in Loki, because I believe there's only one void. And I do believe that this void is somewhere that everyone is eventually going to end up, because this comic over on the left, remember, that is a Secret Wars comic. That seems to be a huge tease for Battleworld, because it's issue number 5 of Secret Wars with Doctor Doom. So it may turn out the void is the only place in the entire multiverse where everyone can show up without creating incursions and causing other issues. So if we look one last time at this multiversal timeline diagram, so in the middle with the red dotted line, that is now Loki Season 1, the loom falling apart, Loki Season 2, creating the tree, and then finally the void that we see in Deadpool and Wolverine. On the top are all of the different universes across the multiverse that are kind of jumping in and out of the MCU. On the bottom is the MCU. In the upper right, we see Deadpool and Wolverine, who I think will end up in the void. And I'm just guessing the Fantastic Four might end up there too. Total guess. We'll have to wait and see how that turns out. But yeah, I think this is the multiversal timeline. So now it's time to talk about what is it like to jump between branches, and what's it like to jump between these alternate universes across the multiverse. So, Chapter 9, Traveling Between Branches. So I want to start with this very important quote from Michael Waldron. And I realize this has never been said in a movie or a TV show, so you could say, well, then this isn't canon then, and that's fair, I understand that. But it was said during Marvel Studios Assembled, the making of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which of course was produced by Marvel and placed on Disney+. So I would suspect that Marvel is okay with this statement because, again, they've not taken it down. It's out there on Disney+. So what does Michael Waldron tell us about traveling between branches, and in particular, the importance of being anchored? So he says, it's impossible, near impossible, to travel from one universe to another. In Loki, you can kind of hop from one timeline branch to another, but you've got to be anchored to some original timeline. So the anchoring is the key. What America can do is she can jump from one universe to another. She can literally do the impossible. So she can jump between two places that are not anchored together. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about jumping between anchored branches, things that are connected together. And next chapter, we're going to talk about jumping between universes that are not connected together. So we see lots of examples of branching. Let's talk about all these different branches in the MCU. In Loki, we saw the sacred timeline. We saw branch timelines. In Endgame, we saw that they created branches when they went back in time. And in fact, Scott Lang mentioned timelines, branches, jumping back and forth between them. Obviously, Gamora came from a branch off of 2014, and then she came into 2023. And Fitz talked about branching off, traveling through the quantum realm, and doing so because we're jumping between timelines. But they're anchored. That's the key. Even in the timeline book, they officially showed us that the what if branches are branches off of the sacred timeline, but they're anchored. They're all connected together. We're going to see that's very, very important. In fact, the Watcher himself explains that a single choice can branch out into infinite realities. They're still connected back to the main original reality. In another universe, a single choice created a whole new hero. That's the moment that created a new universe. So basically, these branches are creating new universes connected back to the original 616. And in a multiverse of infinite possibility, is your destiny determined by your nature or by the nature of your world? So again, they're using that multiverse term to refer to Loki's multiversal tree. So then we see how characters can travel safely between these branches, these branched universes. He said, Dr. Strange says, you aren't just our best hope to save one universe. And the Watcher says, you're my last hope to save all of them. You are the guardians of the multiverse. They collected them from all the different connected branches to come together to solve a big problem. And that problem was Infinity Ultron, because he was able to jump between the what-if branches. The entire multiverse at your fingertips, and you spent all your time up there. The boundaries of the multiverse are irrelevant to beings like you and me. But again, this is the multiversal tree of Loki, which is all connected together via branches. The Watcher plopped the Black Widow in a branched universe, a different one than hers, and it didn't cause a problem, right? She was taken from her original universe and placed in a new one, but they were branched and connected. Doctor Strange jumped between branches. He grabbed Kahori in one episode, he grabbed Peggy Carter in another one. And of course, the Scarlet Witch was jumping between branches, we saw repeatedly. In fact, they described it as the Scarlet Witch, Wanda Maximoff, used her powers to reach into a neighboring universe, basically a branched or connected universe. And that's so important to note because, remember, in Multiverse of Madness, Wanda could not travel to 838. Only America could, which goes back to Michael Waldron's quote, right? Because the only choice that Wanda had was either to force America to send her to the universe that she wanted to go, 838, or take America's power for her own. But notice there was no option of using a spell. Wong didn't know how to get to 838, Doctor Strange didn't know how to get there, and Wanda, who'd looked the Darkhold over from front to back, had no idea how to get to 838. So again, you can jump between branched universes, but if they're not branched to each other, if they're not connected in the same tree, you can't get there, unless, of course, you're America Chavez. So we also see that Infinity Stones can be used across different branches of the same tree. Obviously, the whole time heist was based on the fact that they could jump in a different timeline, grab a stone, and then use it back in the main timeline. Infinity Ultron used them across all the different branches. But it is important to note that every universe is different, each one just a fraction unique. So even though the stones can be used across the different branches, they are still unique, even if it's just microscopically unique, maybe one atom different or whatever, because the bottom line is the Crusher, as we learned in the first season, was designed to destroy the stones on one world, but not another. So the stones could work across branches, but the Crusher couldn't because of that minuscule difference that the stones had. Then, also, it's worth noting, we've even seen two timelines in the same universe, in the same branch, if you will. So the Eye of Agamotto, cradle of temporal singularity. By the way, there's that word again, singularity. Crazy, huh? But it was discovered by Cagliostro for the manipulation and alteration of timelines. So then we learn that the Ancient One drew upon the power of the Dark Dimension, split the timeline to split you, and allowed for two of your possible timelines to occur in one universe. And actually, it's not the only time we've seen that happen, because in What If Season 2, we also saw in the 1602 episode, there was a similar situation, because Steve Rogers went to strike with my shield, he says, and I hit one of the Infinity Stones instead, presumably the Time Stone, because with all these rifts forming, we learned from Peggy Carter that two time periods, the 1600s and the early 21st century, have been compressed. And if I don't find a way to unstick these time periods, the universe will shatter. So definitely having two timelines in the same universe is bad. We saw it in the first season with the Doctor Strange episode, and we saw it in 1602. But that aside, going between different branches is no problem. Wanda did it, Doctor Strange did it, the Watcher did it, etc. It doesn't create incursions. It doesn't create any issues whatsoever. However, going between different universes that are not branched off each other, that's a whole different story. So, traveling between alternate universes. In Multiverse of Madness, we learn that America Chavez can form a portal between universes. But let's be clear, it's not the same thing as going between branched timelines or branched universes. We saw that happening in What If, left and right. They jumped between the branched universes like it was nothing. Instead, we're talking about going between completely disconnected. There's no anchor point, there's no branch between them, completely disconnected universes. So, for example, America could jump between 616 and 838. Something Doctor Strange couldn't do, Wanda couldn't do, Wong couldn't do, etc. She could do it innately with her own abilities in creating these portals. Now, I do have to wonder, though, even though she didn't really understand how she was creating them, can we find clues to how these portals were being created if we look across the MCU? Well, interestingly, we learned that in Thor the Dark World, the Dark Elves used something called black hole grenades. Now, if you remember the movie, they never called them black hole grenades. So how do we know that's what they're called? Of all things, Spider-Man Homecoming, the Vulture's scavenger crew, right? They had things like Shatari railguns and then also black hole grenades. They give a name to these things from Thor the Dark World. So what on earth are black hole grenades? Well, the Marvel Cinematic Universe Wiki, which granted it's a fan site, but it has a really good theory. It says the black hole grenade is a weapon used mainly by the Dark Elves that creates a miniature gravitational singularity. Whoa. A miniature gravitational singularity. And if you think about it, that's what we saw in the movie, because Malekith was just chucking these things left and right. And notice, it would create this gravitational pull, but just around the focused area here. Nowhere else was affected. So when you threw it on the throne, it just sucked in the throne itself, and then it vanished. So, is it possible that at the center of her portal, America Chavez is creating her own miniature singularity, her own black hole, if you will? I mean, she obviously doesn't know that's what she's doing, but is that the mechanics behind it? Well, if we look really closely as it forms, notice a bright star in the center. Maybe that's a singularity. Maybe that's what she's created there. Because once it vanishes, once it disperses, we definitely see that we end up with this portal between two different universes. So whether she's doing it intentionally or not, I have to wonder if maybe that's what she's doing, because this portal looks so similar to the rift that we see forming in the Marvels. In fact, let's go take a look at that to see if we get more hints to how America's doing what she's doing. In the Marvels, Dar-Ben used the bangles, which I believe are Kang tech. I think we're eventually going to find that out. And she creates a rift in space. She didn't mean to, but she ends up doing that. And notice at the center of the rift, there is a black hole. Most definitely. A singularity, right? And when it vanishes, now we have the rift between two alternate universes. Looks very, very similar again to America's. And look at how Monica describes it. A self-propagating singularity with negative mass and non-Newtonian topology. I love Kamala looking at her like, what are you saying? So Monica dumbs it down a bit for all of us and says she tore a hole in space-time. And basically, that is a different reality bleeding into ours. So Monica, of course, goes in, closes the rift, but she ends up on the other side where she meets Beast. And Beast explains it as best he can. He says, my theory, you somehow cross through a tear in space-time. You are now in a reality parallel to your own. Notice he says parallel. In other words, not connected, no branches. It's very similar to how He Who Remains described them as stacked on top of each other. Very interesting. And then he says, which of course is impossible. And Beast is one of the smartest people on the planet. So the fact that he doesn't know how to jump between two different alternate universes, that says something really special happened, right? Also, if we look at Moon Girl, which I realize Moon Girl is not part of the MCU, at least not yet, but if we look at her series, I think we learned something very interesting about going between alternate universes. So at the end of season 1 and into season 2, she's pulled into a mysterious portal, and she ends up on an interdimensional highway. And that's the Beyonder, or their version of the Beyonder, which is interesting, right? The Beyonder, Secret Wars. But anyway, so the Beyonder says, you're right. An interdimensional highway is no place for a human like you. So they travel down the highway, and they get out of it and land on a planet that it turns out the Beyonder wrecked. Now, I won't go into why. You can check out the episodes if you want to. But the key is, to get back home, Lunella says we could use the black hole to get back home. So she says, when matter enters a black hole, it's at the risk of being stretched into a thin ribbon by the hole's gravitational pull as it approaches the singularity. In fact, what happens when you approach the singularity? Spaghettification. Too funny. They're using the same terms from Loki, and of course, Victor Timely demonstrated spaghettification many, many times. So then she says, however, if an object travels through the non-spinning black hole fast enough, it can make it through the singularity virtually unaffected. Wow. So she says, I just need to build something that will travel as fast as the speed of light to survive the travel. And the only thing theorized to yield Alcubierre warp drive is negative mass. Alcubierre warp drive? What is she talking about, right? Well, once again, Marvel uses science theory because the Alcubierre drive is a speculative warp drive idea according to which a spacecraft could achieve apparent faster-than-light travel by contracting space in front of it and expanding space behind it under the assumption that a configurable energy density field lower than that of a vacuum, i.e. negative mass, could be created. So she says, that's it, I'll build a ship propelled by negative mass. And you might remember the words negative mass because Monica said that as well, a self-propagating singularity with negative mass. So everything is just syncing up so well between all these shows and movies, right? So time to go home. Sure enough, Lunella is able to travel through the black hole and to get back to her universe again. So cool. I also think in Loki season 1, we went on a trip backwards through the reverse creation, if you will, of a universe back to its very first origin point as we keep going backwards, 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 and we exit a black hole, i.e. a singularity, for that universe, and we jump over to a second universe. We enter its black hole, its singularity, and we see the creation of that universe as we go forward, because there's the planets being formed. We eventually go down this, I would argue, multiversal highway, I guess, interdimensional highway, similar to what we saw in Moon Girl. A lot of this imagery is the same. It's just so cool. And of course, we then ultimately end up outside of the sacred timeline, viewing it from the Citadel at the end of time. So I think Loki's season was showing us how to exit one black hole, reverse, and then enter a second one, and to see that that is how those universes were formed. In fact, does a new universe actually get created out of a black hole? Well, yeah, we kind of saw it in What If Season 2, because we learned that Strange isn't trying to save universes, he's trying to resurrect his universe. He uses this device to ultimately, I believe, create a singularity. I mean, whether that's a white hole or a black hole, it's a little hard to tell, what they're trying to go for there, but it's definitely a singularity because Doctor Strange created this universe, but he was never born into it. So he created literally a new universe out of a singularity, a black hole. Also, I love this, the Celestials travel via a black hole. Did you notice this from the Eternals movie? Arishem, at the end of the movie, when he leaves, he forms a black hole. That's what he enters into, and it closes, and he's gone to seemingly appear at the World Forge, which may be in a different dimension, different universe. We're not sure where that's located. But yeah, even the Celestials traveled via a black hole. So we're seeing repeatedly these black holes are being used to jump between alternate universes. And only America is able to do it on her own. Everybody else had to do it through either Kang Tech, accidents, etc. In fact, look at this. The destruction of Asteroid M in X-Men 97. Is this creating a black hole? So nukes are sent into the core of Asteroid M, and when it blows up, watch this, something is definitely forming on the inside. Is this supposed to be a black hole? I'm not sure, but I know this much. When it all clears, that sure looks like a rift in space. And if you watched X-Men 97, you know that at least 3 of the characters are gone, and we don't know where they ended up. Are they in a different universe? Who knows? We have to wait and find out. But I just love how we consistently keep seeing these black holes. Because again, only America can do this on her own, but there are ways that accidentally, like sending nukes at this thing, you can create these rifts. Speaking of accidents, so what does this mean then for the fact that Doctor Strange essentially created a portal between universes, right? He pulled in all the villains, the 2 Spider-Men, Venom, sort of Morbius. I don't know what was going on with Morbius. He didn't pull in Morbius, but sent Vulture to Morbius's world. But regardless, did Doctor Strange do this? I thought only America could do it, right? Well, we have to look at the details here. The spell he used travels the dark borders between known and unknown reality. And on top of that, Peter changed the spell 6 times. That spell was out of control. If I hadn't shut it down, something catastrophic could have happened. And of course, something catastrophic does end up happening. But the key is, this was not intentional. He had no idea how it happened. It was a combination of mistakes, and I do not think he could have recreated it as easily as he did here. He shut it off. He reversed it. But creating a new one? No, I don't think he can, because in Multiverse of Madness, remember, Doctor Strange couldn't get to 838 and certainly couldn't get back home to 616. He needed America to do it. So Doctor Strange couldn't cast a spell, Wong couldn't cast a spell, Scarlet Witch couldn't cast a spell. That's because alternate universes, disconnected, you can't do it. You cannot do it unless apparently you're America Chavez, who can do it innately, or you manage to create a black hole. So very, very cool. I love how consistent all of this is across the MCU. But that does lead to the next chapter, which discusses what happens when these universes start to collide. Chapter 11, Incursions between universes. So we see in Loki Season 1 that alternate universes are stacked on top of one another, because He Who Remains shows this image of the different alternate universes, and don't they look so nice and neat, like there'd never be a problem between them? Well, it turns out there's at least 3 ways that you can have incursions form between alternate universes. So Reed Richards in Multiverse of Madness lays out each of the ways it can happen. First, he explains, an incursion occurs when the boundary between 2 universes erodes and they collide, destroying one or both entirely. So basically, if the boundary erodes, you can have an incursion. And I think we see an example of that illustrated by Kang in Quantumania, right? He says they, the other Kangs, were playing with time like children. And then he shows an illustration. He creates a circle, which I believe is an example of one universe. And he says, I saw their chaos. And then he throws that circle in the air, and another circle forms down below. And he says their chaos was spreading across realities. Universes colliding. And notice the branches now are forming off of what otherwise was a perfectly nice circle. Slowly the branches are forming upwards and downwards until you end up with endless incursions. So basically he's showing us how these 2 universes are going to cause a problem because they were playing with time, right? I saw the multiverse and it was dying. So very cool. I'm pretty sure that's an illustration of what Reed Richards was explaining. Also, I love this interview from Kate Herron way back in 2021. She said the branches are like bridges to other timelines where these other versions of He Who Remains will be. So basically the branches start to form bridges connecting the 2 universes, thus eroding those boundaries between them. And she also said, so there's the branches, right? Which is like the alternate reality. But then something, you'll see it, it's very subtle, but in the very last shot where you see the multiverse, there's like basically other bigger physical timeline branches. So it's almost like these different separate trees that are now connecting. Can you believe that? She literally used the word tree, as in like Loki's tree, way back in 2021 to discuss how these bridges can form between the different timelines. She goes on to say it's almost like a bridge. If you can imagine the branch, it's like another reality. But if the branch extends beyond a certain point, it will then connect to other physical timelines. That last shot we did, there are like other thicker branches that are meant to be our timeline, and there are the other timelines like that, and the branches are the connectors, basically. So she's essentially describing, way back in 2021, what the Kang from Quantumania was showing to Janet. Very cool. I love how it all connects. All right, the second way you can cause an incursion is by visiting alternate universes. So, Reed Richards says, Stephen, your arrival here confuses and destabilizes reality. The larger the footprint you leave behind, the greater the risk of an incursion. And I think we saw that in No Way Home, right? Because Doctor Strange realized they got to get those villains and the Spider-Man back to their universe. He says, I need you to capture them and bring them here while I figure out how to get them back home before they destroy the fabric of reality. So basically, we started to see an incursion forming because those villains and ultimately the Spider-Man were in the wrong universe. So going to an alternate universe, big time problem. However, we've seen multiple times that going to branched universes is not an issue, right? Gamora came from the 2014 branch. We saw the Watcher putting Black Widow in another branch, etc. They jumped all over to different branches throughout What If, the Time Heist, etc. Never were any issues of incursions. So that's really important to notice. And it does make you have to wonder, why don't we have an incursion? in the Morbius post-credit scene, or eventually would we have gotten one, because the Vulture was sent to Morbius's universe. Oh, worst post-credit scene ever, right? I'm not sure how I got here. Has something to do with Spider-Man, I think. Oh, oh, so painful, so painful. I mean, first of all, there's no way Doctor Strange's spell would randomly throw Vulture into the Morbius universe. But even if it did, the Morbius universe, which I think is the same as the Venom universe, would be destroyed. So it's ridiculous. And actually, I think Sony did a mea culpa and fixed this, because in Across the Spider-Verse, they seem to imply the Collider event is why Vulture was shot into Morbius, not because of Doctor Strange's spell. So Spider-Gwen says, "You're not my Vulture. What are you, made of parchment?" And we see a Vulture from a different universe. What cursed world have you brought me to? Well, you were having an espresso in some old-timey Leonardo da Vinci dimension, and suddenly a portal opens up and you wind up here. And that portal is because of the Collider event into the Spider-Verse. Then Miguel says, "You left a hole wide enough for guys like him to randomly get shot into the wrong dimension. Now I'm stuck putting everybody back where they belong." So I'm hoping that Miguel essentially put Vulture back in 616 and just erased that terrible post-credit scene. But I love the idea that Morbius and that post-credit scene didn't happen because of Doctor Strange's spell, that it happened actually because of the Collider event. Beautiful, beautiful. All right, so the third and final way that you can create an incursion is dreamwalking. So Reed Richards explains that the variant of Doctor Strange, the Doctor Strange from their universe, had been dreamwalking, and he inadvertently triggered an incursion, the annihilation of another universe. So that actually did physically create an incursion. It wiped out a whole nother universe. So basically, you can create incursions by the boundaries being eroded, by going to a different universe, and also by dreamwalking. So very, very dangerous ways to make those alternate universes create incursions. So now it's time to summarize all this in our final chapter. Chapter 12, Conclusions about the Multiverse. So we're going to summarize everything we've learned about the difference between branched versus alternate universes. And we're going to look at 3 key categories: movement between them, incursion risk, and how the Infinity Stones operate. So movement between branched universes. We've seen it happen 3 different ways: via magic, Doctor Strange and Wanda; via science, the Time Heist and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and via innate powers, because the Watcher is a 5th-dimensional being. He can jump at will between branches and even jump outside the tree. Incursion risk. We learn that there is no risk created by visiting other branches. Infinity Stones. The stones are similar enough to be used between branches. We saw it during the Time Heist, and we've seen Infinity Ultron do it. Alternate universes. How about movement between alternate universes? 4 different ways we've seen that happen. Using black holes, the Marvels, Moon Girl. Via magic, it's a very unwise thing to do, but you can use the Darkhold to dreamwalk. Science, it seems that the Kang tech allowed that original meeting between the Kangs for them to maybe create a black hole or a rift using his tech. In fact, that may be, in fact, how it happened in the Marvels, right? And we see that innate powers, there's only one person in the universe, and that is America Chavez. Incursion risk. Actually, 3 different ways to create incursions. If the boundaries between alternate universes erodes, if someone visits from an alternate universe, or if someone dreamwalks into an alternate universe. And the Infinity Stones. They are unique enough across each alternate universe to create different realities, paint, cubed, animated, or even different flows of time. So that is basically the difference between branched and alternate universes. So now, let's see how this working model for the multiverse that I showed way back in chapter 1, how it stands up to all of this. So we have obviously different origin points, different Infinity Stones, and then different alternate universes. They are basically stacked upon one another, just like He Who Remains mentioned, and without people playing with time and creating problems, there's no problem, right? They keep separate and life is wonderful. So let's talk about 616. 616 is a universe, and it has branched universes off of it, and collectively they are Loki's multiversal tree, okay? So how about moving between branches in that tree? Well, we've definitely seen it happen during the Time Heist. The TVA does it. Loki does it. Sylvie does it with the McDonald's universe. Fitz did it. The Watcher can do it on his own. Wanda did it. Doctor Strange did it. Gamora did it, jumping between branches. And of course, Black Widow was placed in a different branch. So there's no problem, does not create incursions. And traveling between them is definitely possible in many different ways. We also see the Infinity Stones work. In the Time Heist and Infinity Ultron proved that you can move between branches and use the stones. Now, we did see that the Stone Crusher is unique per universe, so it was unable to crush the stones, but the stones themselves can be used across branches. And we did also see that you do not want to combine timelines in the same universe. Very, very bad, as we saw in the 1602 What If episode. All right. What about some of these other alternate universes? Well, of course, 838 was visited by America. She was able to jump between them. She's the only one that can do it, and she brought with her Doctor Strange. And in fact, they went on quite a tour of the multiverse. They saw paint, they saw animated, etc. We learned that these alternate universes can indeed cause incursions if you play with time, like the Kang Council has done, and that could create incursions between universes. In fact, we almost saw one happen during No Way Home, when the Spider-Man and the villains were pulled into 616 via the botched spell of Doctor Strange. We also see that you can create a rift between alternate universes, a rift in space via a black hole, and that is how Monica was able to get over to see Beast. We've also seen that in the X-Men universe, Deadpool was able to jump between the branches. It initially seemed like what he was doing was rewriting time, but I'm beginning to wonder if there are indeed branches, because it certainly looks like the Deadpool TVA is monitoring branches. And of course, that's why I think they're separate from the 616 TVA, because in that one, they're now monitoring Loki's tree. So I really do think they're different, but we'll find out in Deadpool and Wolverine. And the other thing we learned from the trailers for Deadpool and Wolverine is there's only one Void, and I do think that's where both he and Wolverine, both Deadpool and Wolverine, will end up at the end of the movie. So we'll have to wait and see. So there you go. I still don't know what to call the whole thing. I don't know whether to call it a forest of trees or a megaverse. So I'm hoping Marvel will give us that word at some time. But I do think this model works perfectly for the multiverse. And that's why I keep showing this multiversal timeline, so kind of keep this in mind. We're going to learn a lot more when we get to Deadpool and Wolverine and also Fantastic Four. So there you go. That is a relatively short history of the multiverse. So during this video, I have literally talked about 30 different MCU movies, TV shows, or connected things like, Morbius, Venom, Spider-Verse, etc. 30 things, and I believe they all tie together so well. I'm very, very impressed how this overall story has been coming together. Kudos. Kudos, Marvel. So, that's the end, at least for now. Much more to come, starting with, of course, Deadpool and Wolverine. All right, hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget, we do have a June contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment. You can win a book or a steel book. And of course, there's that membership option in case you're interested in that. And we have the Discord. I want to make sure you get an invite to that. 1,300 people across the globe. And notice we have a metaphysics chat, and that's where you can talk all about the multiverse. We brainstorm ideas. It's so much fun. So I will leave a pinned comment so that you can join. Love to have you be part of the conversation. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.